2 years ago, I had a massive jaw surgery to correct an overbite that was causing sleep apnea. And the entire recovery process the last 2 years has been brutal, but the worst part was that the first year, the muscles remained locked in pain such that every yawn, every sneeze, every loud room sent shooting pain through my face, and nothing helped. One day I was at the orthodontist, my mouth was wide open, I was trying to not cringe in pain as they adjusted my braces, and my orthodontist suggested dry needling to me. See, when a muscle is traumatized, it tightens to protect itself. And that protective clenching over time becomes a habit so that the muscle forgets how to release even when the threat is gone. So, in dry needling, a physical therapist finds the muscle knot and inserts a needle straight into the center of the knot. The muscle will spasm and freak out, habitually clenching harder around the needle in order to protect itself from the pain. But then, something strange happens. The needle's presence disrupts the habit of the muscle, and the muscle releases. Sometimes as the needle goes in and I experience the intense pain and the clenching, in the very next moment I will feel my muscle in my face relax for the first time in weeks. It just surrenders. Like many of you, I've been thinking about how America's muscles are constantly knotted in defensive clenching. And to be fair, they always have been, though white folks have not always noticed it. But the tension that we feel, it seems like in this cultural moment, continues to tighten and it continues to clench as our culture and our algorithms continue to rehearse fear and reward certainty and push propaganda. We are being habituated by our society and what we consume. We are being habituated into self-defensive soul clenching. And it's coming from everywhere. It's coming from families, it's coming from churches, it's coming from our systems of meaning. Former Boston Globe columnist Elisa Valdez Rodriguez described one form of it as cultural trauma produced by religious gaslighting. She writes, quote, "Because when you've been raised to believe that love looks like unquestioned power, punishment, and the holy belt of righteous correction, when you've been taught that independent thought is the devil's playground, when you have been trained to believe that your needs will only be met by enabling and defending a person who hurts you, then a narcissistic strongman doesn't scare you. He feels like home." Formation like that does not just teach us ideas. It's training our emotional reflexes. It teaches the body what safety feels like, and once something feels safe, we cling to it even if it kills us. We cling to it even if it's not true. As an overly educated person, I labored for far too long under the delusion that if people just knew more, if people were just better educated, if people just had all the facts and I could show them all the facts, then they would see the truth. And they would give up being propagandized. And they would clearly see things my way. Because I'm right. But politicians understand what often pastors and professors forget, which is that people are not primarily rational creatures. It's a bit of an overstatement to say that we are Homo sapiens, that is, humans of wisdom. We are humans who feel. People are not primarily rational. We are liberal and conservative alike. We are primarily feelers whose number one objective is to feel safe. And we will ignore facts. All of us. We will ignore facts if falsehoods give us what we want. If falsehoods make us feel safe. Which means, if I can give you Tom First's diagnosis of the large American problem, which means the primary problem in America is not ignorance. The primary problem is not irrationality. The primary problem in America is that none of us are propagandized against our will. None of us, liberal or conservative, are propagandized against our will. Propaganda is rhetoric that offers the feeling of safety without the frustration of having to deal with facts. It gives us nothing new. It simply gives us what we already wanted. Whether we are on the right or the left, propaganda just gives you what you wanted. And according to the Christian tradition, that's not a partisan problem. That's a love's problem. Augustine diagnosed this almost 2,000 years ago. The church's first great theologian said that the deepest human problem is not what we think, but what we love. What we love shapes our thinking. What we love shapes what we desire. So the problem with propaganda is not simply that it intellectually deceives us, it is that it gives us what we wanted. The problem with disinformation is not simply that it deceives, it is that it affirms what we already think without questioning what we love under what we think. And so both of them play on what Augustine calls disordered loves. That is, loving the wrong thing or loving a secondary thing as if it is primary. Both work, here's the key, both work with our will, not against it. This is why you don't see people going kicking and screaming into cults. This is why you don't see people going kicking and screaming into oppressive or violent ideologies, because these ideologies appeal to what people already want. It works with their will. So, I mentioned that I'm an overly educated person. My PhD is not in theology. My PhD is in rhetoric, because I'm interested in how language works, how propaganda works, how deception works, and what might actually move people to the truth. And so I have been asking in this cultural moment, as our self-defense mechanisms are causing us to clinch and become habituated in our defensiveness, I have been asking, what kind of rhetoric can help shock the system of the soul so that it can surrender? What kind of discourse can shock the American muscle out of its trauma and habituated knots so that it can release and receive the goodness and beauty of both God and neighbor? We need a way of speaking that shocks us without destroying the soul, that tells the truth without reinforcing the hardness of heart. A truth that does not merely inform the mind, but reforms what we love. And here's the best part. That kind of rhetoric already exists. And the prophets of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament provide us exactly what we need. They're called parables. And they're not cute little moral tales. In fact, I think if you take the parables seriously, you'd probably step back, scratch your head, and say, what kind of morality is that? That's absurd. Because it is intended to be absurd. It's intended to shock us. You see, Jesus understood that not everyone has ears that are capable of hearing what he had to say. And Moses understood that Pharaoh's heart muscles were so knotted tight in self-defense that he was never going to let the people go. And the prophet Nathan comes to David and he recognizes this is still a human with a conscience, but if I come at him directly and accuse him of murdering Uriah and assaulting Bathsheba, then he's going to be defensive. But if I come through a different angle, through the angle of parables, I can incite a feeling of justice in him. Our self-inflicted ideologies filter what we accept and what we reject, and that rarely has anything to do with facts. And so Jesus and the prophets use parables as a strategy to shock our knotted muscles into surrender. Theologian Catherine Keller describes a parable as, quote, a wisdom story that interrupts presumption with an open-ended interaction. 3 parts. It is a wisdom story that interrupts what you presume the truth to be and opens up an open-ended interaction that considers what the truth might alternatively be. Parables retrain our habits of thinking by bypassing our expectations and by reforming our desires, not just our logic. Thus, they do not provide rational argument because Jesus understood he's not primarily dealing with rational people. Rather, parables provide a completely backward perspective that is not beholden even to our common sense. When I asked my father-in-law if I could marry my wife, She wasn't my wife then, but if I could marry his daughter. He later told my wife, his daughter, I like Tom, he just doesn't have a lot of common sense. I like to think now that he didn't intend it that way, but it was a complete compliment. I am not beholden to common sense. And so because Jesus tells these parables that critique what we consider common sense, that critique our categories for thinking, Jesus will end up telling parables about good Samaritans, which is like saying a peaceable terrorist. Do you see how counterintuitive that sounds? He will tell stories about employers who pay the same amount of money to their employees, whether those employees worked for a full week or just 1 hour. And every one of us is like, that's injustice. That does not fit with how I see labor justice working. He tells a story about wealthy hosts who fill their banquets and their households with unhoused people who can't pay them back, including who can't pay them back through social connection. He tells about farmers who waste seed on bad soil. And one of my favorite parables of all, he tells about a widow who relentlessly stalks and protests a sitting Supreme Court justice until he changes his ruling. These are not reasonable stories. They disrupt common sense, and that's the point. They disrupt our clinched habits, including our religious ones. They disrupt our self-defensiveness so that we can surrender to the God who is not bound to our categories. But let's be honest about what's difficult about this. You see, parables may make surrender possible. They may even make healing imaginable. But parables do the one thing that we find absolutely irritating. Parables never force you to do anything. You see, information is pushing us to imperatives. It's pushing us to understand there's rules we have to follow, things we have to do. Facts demand submission. This is why when I argue with my political opponents, I bring facts to the table so that they must submit to those facts. And I live under this delusion that one day they'll wake up and realize I'm right. But what do I want? I want them to submit to my facts. And they want me to submit to their facts. And so facts demand submission, but parables invite surrender to uncertainty. They embrace ambiguity. Wait, the Good Samaritan is the moral model? The farmer wasting his seed is the good farmer? Parables invite us to imagine a God who is not held captive to our red and blue clenching. They invoke a range of emotions beyond what our society tells us is acceptable. They reveal a mystery that we cannot control by our common sense discourse, a mystery that leads us to exactly the place we are continually resisting going. Parables lead us into vulnerability. They lead us into exposure. They lead us into the risk of unsafety. This means then, friends, that a community that is open to a God who invites surrender must be a community offering a safe place for people to land. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." He's not saying avoid conflict. He's saying reimagine it so that surrender rather than submission becomes a possibility. He is describing a people formed in the practices of surrender, which means that we don't force other people to abandon their certainties for ours. I'm not trying to create people in my image. I'm just as thoroughly ideologically entrenched as anybody else. We are to be communities that create space for reflection, for release, for reformation. We have these conversations at like denominational levels about making sure that we're getting the results that we want out of our worship services and out of our pastors, and what metrics are we going to use to evaluate what church success looks like. I participated recently in a nationwide conversation, and the metrics always come back to the same. Were you charismatic enough to make sure that your church is big? Is it growing? Church growth is the primary metric by which church is evaluated. Now, I'm just going to ask you, two churches who share a downtown corner, do you really feel like you've been unsuccessful all these years because your churches haven't grown? Or is it possible that you've actually been a living parable of what it looks like to be faithful to a community where people, because of racism and classism, leave and go somewhere else? Maybe you're a living parable of what faithfulness looks like. But parables ask us to give up the results, to give up the control of the metrics. We tell the truth that questions everyone's certainties, including our own. We are to be a community of open-handed speech and open-ended stories that leave room for open-ended responses, including open doors for people who don't quite get it like we do. Because it turns out we don't quite get it either. So if we're going to speak in ways that heal without coercion, we must become a people who are no longer habituated by red or blue, no longer habituated to the certainties handed to us in our media, but open to a presence that is larger and outside of anything that we are trying to defend. A story where the power of God is seen in the traumatic foolishness of a crucified man. This is the story we exist to tell. That God's world is not run by the powerful and the elite. That God's world is run by the crucified, the lynched, the sick, the poor, and the suffering. That's the story we have to tell. That's our whole politic. And when we finally can therefore unclench what we no longer have to protect, our muscles remember how to surrender to God. Our muscles remember how to heal with each other. Our muscles remember how to love.